We're going to move on now. As I mentioned earlier, we've got first of two research presentations. So Laurie Patterson and Professor Sue Backhouse from Leeds Beckett University, who just got a mention in the keynote there. So we're going to hear about this sort of what we're calling Work Package 3, but it's focused on athlete support personnel and a series of interviews with athlete support personnel.
Thanks very much, Ian, and brilliant to see so many familiar faces, certainly, and to see each other not behind a screen. So fantastic to be here. We won't do lots in terms of speaker introductions, but Laurie and I both work in the Carnegie School of Sport at Leeds Beckett University. We're really pleased to be part of the First Respect project and to engage with our collaborators and community through that work, and then to have the opportunity to extend into Respect P. Our focus is very much about athlete support personnel, and many of you in the room are athlete support personnel, and perhaps navigating some of the opportunities and challenges that we're going to share with you through the findings of the research that we are going to talk about today. So the title of our presentation is Clean Sport, a qualitative inquiry into the lived experience of athlete support personnel. The reason we're focusing in our work package on athlete support personnel is very much because we recognise through our own work over the last few years that the athlete support personnel voice is often not heard, and that the predominance of research that has been undertaken is considering the athletes in particular and the risk to doping of athletes, and not necessarily considering some of those influences around those athletes in as much detail as perhaps we may wish to do so. So through the Respect P project and amplifying the voice of athlete support personnel, we had an opportunity to really foreground the experience of those influential agents, the key stakeholders within the sporting landscape. And there's an example of some of those individuals, athlete support personnel, Pippa's here and has just presented a brilliant illustration of the power of a doctor, a medic with a very strong integrity, positionality, and how that inspires others to act in certain ways, just by the way that she was talking about the importance of integrity, the value of operating with the principle of do no harm at the forefront of the actions. But one of the things that we often talk about, and we've got Protect Your Sport and the mugs around the room today, it takes a team. It takes a team in terms of the performance aspects of sport, but it really takes a team in terms of upholding the integrity of sport and protecting the rights of athletes to clean sport. So we were trying to look at that team and to get a sense and an understanding of how that team operates with regards to clean sport. We had a number of research questions that form the basis of the work package for athlete support personnel, and what we're going to give you a flavour of today was the question that we posed around what do athlete support personnel do as part of their clean sport role. And the assumption there is the fact there is a policy prescribed role for athlete support personnel. Under the World Anti-Doping Code, there are certain roles and responsibilities that are contingent on athlete support personnel to undertake. So we wanted to understand what they're doing, but we also wanted to understand how they're doing things, but also why they are acting or not acting in certain ways. So that was the focus very much of the questions that we posed. How did we go about answering that question? We were very much trying to get the lived experience, so we took a qualitative methodology approach to this work. We engaged in 40 semi-structured interviews. I think we'd only said we'd do 10 to 12. So we got really quite excited around the ability to go across 6 countries in seeking to understand experience across multiple athlete support personnel roles. And you can see an indication there of the roles that we were able to engage with through the purpose of this research, and had a really good balance of roles across those 6 European countries. All of those interviews, importantly, were undertaken in the native language and then were translated and then transcribed for the analysis process. What's also important to recognise is the balance of males and females within the sample, which again is important because sometimes the dominant voice in research is often the male voice and the male lens, and we got a good representation of females within that sample as well for the research. We're going to give you a bit of a flavour of some of those findings today, and this process actually of our sharing with you some of the thoughts, some of our interpretations is still part of what we call our reflexive thematic analysis. So we're keen to hear from you whether the findings resonate with you, and we'll give some time at the end of the presentation just to get some feedback from you as to whether or not you can resonate with the findings that we've got. You can draw on your own experiences in interpreting that and kind of seeing yourselves in some of those quotes and descriptions. So the first theme that we'll illustrate through quotes and our interpretation is the preoccupation with managing inadvertent doping risk influence the actions of athlete support personnel. The second theme is that athlete support personnel are an untapped source of influence and the environment constrains behaviour. And then the third theme we'll illustrate is that athlete support personnel struggle to process the possibility that their athletes could dope on their watch, under their care, under their support. And we'll bring those to life through the presentation today. So Laurie and I are going to do a bit of a double act between each of those themes. So I'm now going to move to the side and Laurie will come in on the first theme.
We've not practiced the changeovers, so hopefully we don't drop the baton.
I don't know where's best to stand.
Yeah, and I normally like to look at the big screen, so this is a bit new. So I'll start with the first theme. So as Sue said, there's this preoccupation with inadvertent doping. All their eggs are in that basket, essentially, with the ASP. So they've got this tunnel vision on preventing accidents. So they don't want their athletes to take anything that could contain a prohibited substance. And of course, we're talking mostly about medications and supplements. So our doctor from the Netherlands here would say the first thing they do when an athlete comes to them is get them to download the app. So they're very lucky in that country. They've got a lovely resource. If they haven't got it, I tell them to install it now. I always do that with the athlete. Then we just enter what they've had to enter beforehand. I always run through how they should do that, to check a substance, to check a supplement. Then I always take a look in light of the medications they have, and I go through it with them. I always do that. So this is something that was echoed across the medical staff in particular, in terms of our medications, assisting with TUE processes, but also our other staff were quite comfortable demonstrating how to check substances, or perhaps just reminding athletes that they have to check substances. Now, I mentioned the medics, and it's really helpful that Pippa kicked us off today with that medical lens, because the reality is this role does typically default to the medics. It's not formally assigned, it's not necessarily discussed, but it lands with them oftentimes. So they're the most active in terms of the nature of the behaviours that they engage with and the types of support that they're offering to athletes. And the reality is that because the medic is most active, some other support staff are able to be limited in their involvement with anti-doping. So, for instance, we've got a manager here in the UK, team manager. I wouldn't do it myself because it's just not my strength. I kind of put them in touch with the people who are out there. It's like just knowing your role. I've got an oversight, of course, but the experts are these two people. And so in this case, they were talking about someone that works within the organisation who's dedicated to anti-doping. So this sport has anti-doping. And they were also talking about a nutritionist, interestingly, in this case. If anybody comes to me with any concerns or questions regarding supplements or medications, so obviously that's all they're going to get contact about, I'll always send them to the expert in that area. I definitely wouldn't say, no, go ahead and take it. I'd always put them onto the experts within the organisation. So we've got people like our managers, our agents, coaches, and S&C coaches really not doing that much, but they are signposting and they are kind of encouraging athletes to take caution. We kind of had this interesting view of why is it that they're only interested in substances being taken accidentally in medications and supplements? Like, why is it that that's the main concern? And when we were asking the athlete support personnel what they think clean sport means or what is doping to them, quite a lot of them actually came down to saying, well, it's about what the athlete puts in their body. They're not really supposed to put anything in their body that's on the prohibited substance list. And we think that was really driving what they then did in their everyday practice. So just even here, we've got our nutritionist from Germany. I have had to deal with this over the years. It's about what do I take? What am I getting on my skin? What kind of effects could this have? because you have to be careful. I actually see doping very strongly from my area. What do I put in? What do I give out? And so on. And the only real exception to this rule of focusing on inadvertent doping were our psychologists. And psychologists have really rarely been included in anti-doping research before. So it was really nice to hear that voice and actually hear a different narrative come through. So our exceptions, or our psychologists, did work on things that were not related to inadvertent doping. They were working on more holistic development, perhaps. So we had things like dual career, working on self-esteem and emotional control, just as a few examples. So our Irish psychologist explains about the dual career aspect. We try to get them not to define their identity by their sport. It should literally, as we said, it should only be part of their thing, but by emphasising the other aspects of their life, emphasising the results don't define them, we not only allow them to hopefully make better decisions, but we also do allow them to perform. So it's obviously really great that there are some athlete support personnel going beyond this narrative of just not making mistakes, but they were not doing that purposefully. So they didn't set out to prevent doping by doing these things. It was obviously part of their job as a psychologist. That's what they were there for. So obviously enhance the well-being and the health and the performance of their athletes. So our psychologist from the Netherlands kind of helps us explain this. So what I do is limited in the sense of being directly involved in doping prevention. Of course, indirectly, I'm trying to get people back in touch with themselves, with their own emotions, their own self-worth, and as a human being, which would hopefully make them less inclined to cross that line and dope.
So then moving on from the focus that we identified within the interviews and the conversations around that inadvertent doping, managing risk, managing what used to be called in many rooms the dopey dopers. That phrase has been used multiple times. What we heard very strongly from athlete support personnel was their sense of importance and value around fairness and around the health and the protection of the health of the athlete. That came through very strongly in how they narrated what they think about when they think about clean sport, that element of fairness and protecting health. And when they were trying to articulate why that matters, they drew upon their own personal experiences and their personal identity, often talking about a love of sport as an athlete support person, and often that's what brought them into the field. Not only, though, that they were talking about their love of sport, but around the importance of fairness, that kept coming through in terms of the conversation. Beyond a personal identity, this professional identity also was evident within the data. The professional identity about protecting health, doing no harm, but also about the protection of the reputation of their profession and of their practitioner status. That was really important in the way that they discussed the importance of clean sport and the importance of protecting athlete welfare. Here we've got an example from a Slovenian doctor that talk around their kind of values and the positionality of that and how they focus on things. They say athletes and their long-term health especially have to be protected. This is mostly where I'm coming from as a doctor, and that aligns with how Pippa's just articulated her positionality. And also the foundation of what sport represents should be preserved. It is a fair fight. It's not a tool to cheat. So we saw this reiteration throughout those interviews of the importance of clean sport, the importance of fairness, the importance of protecting welfare. But within the conversations that we heard and in our interpretations of that, there's reference to this grey area. And this is why we're talking about the untapped potential of athlete support personnel, why we defined it in that way. Supplements was a grey area. Across multiple support practitioners, the conversation was framed around some of the challenges that they faced in navigating the supplement issue within sport. Here, a German nutritionist talks about the box of tricks of nutritional supplements. With it, perhaps we can give athletes a little fritz. We think that's kind of a little extra, a little buzz, so that you can still reach into your bag of tricks, what works well. And of course, I don't tell the others how I do it, but it works. And there was kind of humour and laughter within that statement. But supplements became something that was remaining to be a challenge within the environment and within a context where the performance narrative is still very dominant. So what does that mean, though, from the perspective of protecting the integrity of sport, protecting rights to athletes to clean sport? We found in those instances where that grey area and the crossing the line conversations happen is that sometimes athlete support personnel were put in difficult situations where they were challenged about how to act, and in some cases didn't act, even though at the time they themselves felt a real discomfort in their integrity and professional practice. Here we've got an example from a physiotherapist in the UK in reflecting on a potential use of a substance, the discomfort that they faced in considering that for their athletes. It was a case of, and again, who they're reflecting on is about their line manager and their interactions on this very case. It was a case of do it, do it, do it. And that's what doesn't sit comfortable, because that's when people start to make choices that aren't informed, that aren't empowered, that aren't autonomous. And that is the grey. That's how it starts. And the reference to you're on a slippery slope. They then reflected on how they navigated that situation, and time's often important in that process, and a reflexivity as a practitioner is really important as well in that process. They said, I was certainly ineffective in terms of challenging back to my line manager. I do remember saying, it doesn't feel right. He's like, no, it's happening. So that constant challenge that can present within particularly performance-pressured environments. We've also got an example there. We definitely found within the data, we interpreted and identified this constant challenge of speaking up. And it's not easy to do that, even though we're often encouraged to do so, not only with formal reporting lines, but also within our own environments where we see challenge and we see threat. This support practitioner, a physiotherapist in the Netherlands, articulated about the intimidation that sometimes can come when faced with a challenging situation, and particularly in terms of their status in that environment at the time. They said, for me, last year I found out how you can be quite intimidated by the coaches and everyone getting on top of it all, because basically you're the new kid on the block. So you can't always just say what you really think. So what your ideals are, they aren't always accepted. We found within the data this constant tension, this incongruence, this conflict between what practitioners thought or how they expressed their thoughts and feelings, but then how they acted, and the disconnect between thoughts, feelings and behaviours and what's around that. And that is very much around the people in that environment, the people surrounding those individuals, but the environmental norms, the conditions within which behaviours may have already been held in place for some time. So that element of not easy to speak up. Over to Laurie.
Good tag team. I think this is our last change. Don't worry, we're not going to make you dizzy. Don't disappear. So yeah, moving to our third and final theme, which is obviously about this denial or this inability to process or difficulty to process the possibility that athletes could dope, the athletes that they're working with specifically could dope. I don't think that many people in the room will be shocked by this first slide, where there's a bit of finger pointing going on. So the ASP obviously thought the problem was not necessarily with their environment, it was kind of over there, so it might be in another country, it's maybe in non-disabled sport, that's much worse than parasport. And actually, just going back to some of the issues already been mentioned, of course doping's not as bad as something else, and in this case there's classification, and obviously that's causing a lot of kind of, I'm looking at Ali and he's laughing. It's causing a lot of kind of fire in people's bellies at the moment. So there's this kind of finger pointing going on, and there's this real strong feeling, and they're adamant that it wouldn't happen in their group. So there's just no way that these people they're working with would do that. They just trust them implicitly. So our Austrian nutritionist says, as far as doping is concerned, I can only say that at least now I have the athletes I work with who actually have nothing to do with it. They only take what they have to take when it comes to dietary supplements, and they don't buy so much in bulk, more just having that food-first approach. So they really try their best to not get involved in anything that could cause them harm, and they certainly wouldn't intentionally do anything that would be untoward. And the interesting thing about the data that we identified or interpreted this time around, so we have seen this kind of deflection and finger pointing happen before with athlete support personnel. Just generally, you can speak to many people and they'll say, oh, we're not as bad over here as somewhere else. But there was a real emotional element to the data this time around in the conversations that we had. And we talked with our athlete support personnel about what would you do if. So there were a number of scenarios. What would you do if an athlete was found doping? What would you do if you found your colleague was potentially pushing someone down that type of path? And so on and so forth. And when we talked about the athletes potentially doping, there was this real response, that quite a heightened response in terms of the upset it would cause for the ASP. So the Irish agent here talks about the devastation that that would bring. It comes down to trust. I'm working with people that I feel have integrity and are trying to be the best that they do by being clean in doing that. So that would be a real body blow if something like that was to happen. And our final piece of data that we'll present before we hand the floor over to you is really interesting to us because many of the athlete support personnel didn't openly say they are responsible for clean sport. So when we said, what's your role? What do you think you do on a daily basis? They kind of said, oh, maybe not so much, that's the medics. But when it came to someone actually doping, so one of their athletes, this hypothetical situation, they'd doped, they took on some of the blame all of a sudden. So they were not thinking that they were responsible ahead of time, but they would feel very responsible if it actually happened. So I'll leave you with the words of our coach from Germany. I'd reflect very deeply. It's about why did it happen that way? I would always reflect on myself. What did I do wrong? Did I inform him too little or whatever? Did I exert too much pressure? I would reflect on such things myself, and I would say that I am now partly to blame. So, as Sue said at the start of the presentation, we've got some really impressive expertise, experience in the room, and we want to harness that if that's possible. So we want to ask you to just take a couple of minutes now to just sit and reflect on if any of those findings felt familiar in the ways that you've moved through sport, the things that you've been exposed to in your lifetime. Do some of these things feel like things that you can relate to? And when you've done that, obviously, please feel free to share those thoughts and feelings with people on your table if you feel comfortable doing so. And when you've kind of gotten through that part, almost digesting what you've heard, we also want you to think through, what does this mean then? So what would we actually do with these insights that we now have? Would we inform something in our practice, something in our education programs? Would we need to change any policies? Almost like, what are our implications now going forward? So, on those two bombshell questions, we'll just give you a few minutes, okay? Okay, colleagues, I hate to bring such conversation to a kind of sharp pause for now, but we just want to make sure that we obviously are very keen on keeping to the agenda and making sure everyone has the space to engage in the event today. But we just would welcome, and recognising that spaces aren't always easy to convey some of the complexities of conversation, anybody willing from the tables to share some of the essence of the conversation that you've just engaged in following the presentation. Yes, thanks, Philip.
I find it quite, so in the UK, it is more of a offloading. It's not our problem, it's everyone else's. I find as an athlete, the coaches that I knew would say, yeah, it was the other countries. That's where it resonates with me.
Yeah, thank you. Any other things that were resonating?
Yeah, so in terms of resonating, we said, there very much is that feeling of that would never happen within my group of athletes. But equally, the emotionally charged part of, in my experience of having focus groups with ASP, it's that element of we didn't really give it the value it deserved until one of our athletes, who was a talented athlete, who was on the verge of making Olympic long list, failed a test. and then we went back and changed everything about what we do. And we were literally just moving on to how, you know, the values is very much something that's set very early on. It can be quite challenging to change that late on. And so a lot of the focus tends to be around that inadvertent doping, and that's where ASP find themselves focusing their efforts. And yet that gets criticised quite widely. You know, when new things come out, like the glucocorticoid side of things, that came out, and people say, why are we looking at that when there's out and out cheating going on? And the challenge is that it's much easier, much harder to change those values that are set very early. And so I think as a pool of ASP, they tend to look for the bit that they know they can impact on, because it's much more difficult to impact on the values.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Claire. Just aware of time then, what we'd really invite you to do, if you felt able to do so, if you have any further reflections following the event today, once you've gone away, wish to share anything further, Laurie and I would really value just a contact from you. If you want to drop us an email, that would be great. And if throughout the day you have any further thoughts and you want to just have a one-on-one conversation with us, again, we'd really welcome the opportunity to do that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the engagement in the conversation. And we look forward to hopefully further work within the focus on athlete support personnel and engaging the community more widely in that as we move forward. So thank you.